All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully Senator Warner will join us soon. Is Admiral DeMars here? Okay. And are you Mr. Boucher, or Honorable Boucher? Okay, well, at least acknowledge the Honorable Charles Boucher is here to join us, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so thank you for coming. And thanks to everyone for coming here. I'm Dr. Mark Moyer. I'm the director of the project on military and diplomatic history here at CSIS. I usually moderate these events, but since this happens to be my area, I'm going to be one of the participants, but I just want to say a few words. We just moved here this summer after a year at another think tank, and we do events that are focused on history that is relevant to our contemporary world. If you go to our website, you can sign up. I'll give you a few plugs for our upcoming events. October 6th, we have Federica Fascinati coming here to talk about modern Libyan history. October 10th, Carter Malkasian will talk about his new book, Illusions of Victory, the Anbar Awakening and the Rise of the Islamic State. October 18th, Lawrence Friedman will talk about his new book, The Future of War, A History. And on October 24th, Calder Walton will talk about the history of foreign interference in elections. It's actually something that's happened before. Eric, our moderator, is going to go over the directions, but I want to, since this is something that takes a little time to remember, we have a Twitter handle up there, so for those who are watching us remotely, you can tweet questions to us at CSISPMDH. Again, CSISPMDH. So, like I said, I'm going to let Eric Villard from the Army Center of Military History moderate, and Eric actually helped set this event up. He has worked with the producers of the Burns-Novick documentary, and he was interested in bringing together people from different perspectives on the war, and so we're very fortunate we're able to put this group together. So I will turn things over to Eric Villard.
Testing. All right, great. Again, we welcome your questions, and so if you have questions here in the audience, please write down the questions as they occur to you, and if you could also add who you are, who you work for, where you come from, and then pass those down to the end of the aisle, and we'll have someone coming by, collecting them, and then bringing them up to me. So then when we get to the discussion phase, we can go through those and cover those questions. Just a little about me. Again, Dr. Eric Villard from the U.S. Army Center of Military History, which is here at Fort McNair, over by the baseball stadiums, over by what will be the DC United Soccer Stadium. I'm very excited. I'm a soccer player. So I've been at CMH for 17 years now, and I am the principal Vietnam War historian for the Army. My role here is to be a moderator. I am not here to give my opinions on the film. Again, I am an advisor to Ken Burns and the Novick, but as LBJ said, I sell a lot chic and I will not accept money for my role. So there's no financial interest. I do this really as an honor. Indeed, I do a lot of things outside of work. I have a Facebook group. For those of you who are interested, VietnamWarHistory.org. We are now 28,000 members, and it's a really fantastic community. Shout out to my admins. But if you want to continue the discussion, there are places to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to dispense with as much of the formalities as possible to get right into it. We will have opening comments by our 7 panelists, and we will ask them to hold to 8 minutes. It's going to be hard, but just in order to give us time for discussion. So we will go in the order of the panelists that you see here, and then when they are done, I will take the questions you've given me, sort through them, and continue the discussion. If you can have questions, you're certainly welcome to direct it to one or more people. It'd be great if it was a sort of question you could have all of them talk about, if that's possible. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Thomas Vallely, and have him give us the opening salvo in the post-Ken Burns discussion.
Eric, thank you, and Mark, thank you as well for putting together such an interesting afternoon. My name is Tom Vallely. I work at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have worked on Vietnam there for about 30 years. My interest in Vietnam has always been contemporary Vietnam. I don't make any pretensions about having a lot of knowledge, at least prior to working on this film. I worked on this film with Florentine Films for 7.5 years. But my study in Vietnam is about contemporary Vietnam, contemporary politics in Vietnam, and Vietnamese political economy. I had the opportunity to work with the Florentine Films, and my primary area of expertise, and there's other people on this panel that have worked with Florentine Films. It's a rather big operation. I know nothing about the music of the 1960s and 70s. I get confused about the music of the 1960s and 70s. I used to have a little cheat sheet with me, which song was a Beatles song, which song was from, I know so little about music. They used to have to give me a little crib sheet to know, okay, that is Crosby, Stills. I had no idea. I also was in the Marine Corps in Vietnam in 1969. I served in Quang Nam Province. I was a rifleman in the 5th Marines. Florentine Films approached us because they were looking for a team to produce the Vietnam side of the film in Vietnam. And my role in the film basically starts there. It expands a little bit as the film gets developed, but the basic responsibility we had is introduce Florentine Films to the people in Vietnam that are otherwise hard to find access to, and that's what we did. I did not do it alone. I did it with 2 other colleagues, Ben Wilkinson, who at the time was the Harvard Kennedy School representative in Ho Chi Minh City, who those of you that have worked there in the Foreign Service and elsewhere know Ben. Ben is an extremely fluent Vietnamese speaker. He wrote his high school paper on Hill 875. He learned about 875 by Rick Atkinson's book, A Long Gray Line. And that's how we found out about 875 was Ben's high school paper. We also, another person who had worked at the Fulbright School, and Harvard managed the Fulbright University program in Vietnam for now 27 years. That school focused on provinces. We focused on provincial education. So if we had to find someone in Tiên Giang Province or Dak Lak Province, as Robert Ogburn and others can tell you, we know who the province chief is, and we know how to find out what's going on in these various places. So we had to find out, there's really 3, so the 3 of us worked together, and the last gentleman was in the first and the second and third Indochina War, and he was an officer in the Vietnamese Air Force. He was an intelligence officer in the Vietnamese Air Force, and the 3 of us were tasked with finding the communist side of the production. There are 3 basic areas of who we were looking for. The first one is who's obvious that you want in the film. Who are the obvious people that you'd put in the film? And that's not particularly difficult. You'd want Bao Ninh, you'd want Win Nop, you'd want to have General Do Si Nguyen, who built the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You know the ones that you want. The problem is getting Bao Ninh to talk to you is harder than getting the Beatles music. So you need to develop a relationship with him to do that. The second group of people, as we identified by where they served during the war and I'm looking at my watch, where they served during the war, and based on were they at the Battle of Ap Bak, Binja, Adrang, Hill 875, Tet, Mini Tet, where they were. So finding them was more detective work. That was much harder. And let me give you an example using the Hill 875 example. We had an officer in the film, Matt Harrison. He was in the class of '66 at West Point. We needed to find a counterpart for him on the other side, and we read the company, the report, the history report from that unit, found the commander of that battle, and we call him. He's in the hospital. He says, "Oh, I can't help you, but there's a gentleman in Vung Tau who knows exactly what to do." We go to Vung Tau. Wah goes to Vung Tau. We find the guy. Said, "No, it's not me. It's a guy in Tang Wah." So we go to Tang Wah, and we find the gentleman who's in the film, Nguyen Tang Son. He really wants to tell his story. He was a company commander on Hill 875. No one has ever asked his story, and he was a terrific interviewee. So it was detective work to find about half of the people in this film, and then we developed a list of about 80 people, and then Florentine Films, through interviews, would select who they wanted, and then we interviewed them all without a camera. There's no one's filming at the beginning. They're just going forward and saying X, Y, or Z. The third group of people, and I think I'm going to run out of time, is people that talk about politics. So that in this film, the politics of the United States is front and center. The politics of South Vietnam, trying to develop a strategy to build a nation, and the politics of the Communist Party and how they're going to govern the war and conduct the war, both militarily and political. And in that frame, we use Bao Ninh to some extent, but Huy Duc, who's a journalist and a veteran of the Cambodia War, and Mr. Nguyen Nop. And those are the three categories: the obvious ones, the ones by area or battle, and the ones that talk about the internal part of the Communist Party. Once that's all get together, then we're part of the team that, along with other people on the panel, where does that go in the film? And that was the role that I played. Today's my last day. I'm going to miss working on the film, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the production of the film on the Vietnam side. Thank you.
Okay, we've seen the Burns Vietnam epic, or at least some of us have. What do we think of this? The storyline is not very complicated. War is hell. Americans who opposed the war, good. Americans who fought in it, inept, even pitiable. North Vietnamese, admirable. South Vietnamese, hardly worth mentioning. War is hell. Let's all make nice. They probably didn't need 18 hours to tell that story, but there was always one more explosion to feature, one more bloody body to examine, one more anti-war riot to recall. Had there been somewhat greater economy in telling the Burns version of the story, there might have been room to recall that it was aggression by the North Vietnamese communists that led to all this bloodshed and agony. The communist way of war deliberately featured bombs in schoolyards and pagodas, murder of school teachers and village officials, kidnapping and impressment of civilians, indiscriminate rocketing of cities. Or they might have mentioned that under communist rule today, Vietnam is one of the world's most repressive and corrupt societies. They might have mentioned the boat people and other emigres now living in America and elsewhere in the free world who have made, with great courage and industry, made new lives for themselves and their families and enriched our society by doing so. That list could be extended almost indefinitely. What of the filmmaker's outlook? Burns and his associates have appeared at a large number of preview events. At one such session at the museum here in Washington, billed by them as an influencer event, one could not help but be impressed by their self-regard and self-satisfaction. They apparently now view themselves as the premier historians of the Vietnam War, and they are candid in stating their most basic conclusions. Burns, you can find no overtly redeeming qualities of the Vietnam War, he said. I hope I may be forgiven for stating my own conviction that he is in that profoundly wrong, as he was in referring disparagingly to what he called America's puffed-up sense of exceptionalism. Clearly, Burns does not much like America, an outlook that permeates his work. What of the research? We are told the Burns team spent 10 years on this project, and that in the course of it, they interviewed more than 80 people. I know writers, working alone, who have interviewed several hundred people for a single book. The Burns team averaged 8 interviews a year, an interview every month and a half over the decade. Not impressive, at least to me, certainly not comprehensive. Crucial omissions are a damaging flaw in the Burns opus. The great heroes of the war, in the view of almost all who fought there, at least on our side, were the dust-off pilots and the nurses. We don't see much of them. Instead, we repeatedly see poor Moogie Crocker, who we know right away is destined to get whacked. We see over and over again the clueless General Westmoreland, but learn nothing of his refusal to provide modern weaponry to the South Vietnamese, or his disdain for pacification. We see precious little of his able successor, General Abrams. We see and hear almost nothing of William Colby, and so on. These are serious failings in a film that builds itself as, quote, a landmark documentary event. Burns and Company are said to have made a decision not to interview former government officials for the film. Folks, that's like going to an opera and listening only to the chorus and them one at a time, with the diva and the tenor silenced and ignored. How does that contribute to an understanding of the war writ large? Burns repeats in all the materials he distributes the mantra, there is no single truth in war. But there is such a thing as objective truth, elusive though it may be. What we have here is preferred truth as seen through the Burns prism. Finally, the idea that this deeply flawed version of the war, and those who fought it, might somehow facilitate reconciliation, as claimed by Burns, can only be viewed as fatuous. There is no middle ground, and the Burn films demonstrates, if nothing else, how deep and unbridgeable the divide remains.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Eric and to Mark for the opportunity to come by and participate. I'm Mark Silverstone. I'm a historian at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, and I'm going to respond to my prompts from Mark earlier and talk a little bit about my participation and then make some broader remarks. About 6 years ago, I got a call from Sarah Botstein, who told me, and Sarah was one of the producers on the film, who told me that they were going to make this film and they were interested in the work that we were doing at the Miller Center on the presidential recordings. Since 1998, we have sunk in a fair amount of resources to transcribe, annotate, and then publish the secret White House tapes that have been made, starting with Franklin Roosevelt all the way up through Richard Nixon, and as far as we believe, that's as far as they go, until we're told otherwise or we find out otherwise. This work is arduous, it is challenging, and as a result, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we get it right, because when we are offering the Florentine team or anybody else, including Bob, transcripts of material that we have generated, we recognize that while we encourage everybody to go to the audio tapes, those are clearly the primary documents, it's more likely than not that people will avail themselves of the transcripts first. So we began a process over a couple of years of sending to Sarah and then Mariah Doran, another one of the producers, transcripts of conversations that Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon had on Vietnam. We completed this work roughly in around 2014, and obviously there are 3 years between now and then. So our work has continued, and they haven't necessarily had the chance to use additional transcripts that we made. But we do believe that what we sent them was a pretty fair representation of the kinds of conversations that those presidents had on Vietnam, the topics that they felt were most salient, and which they devoted a significant amount of time to. And I'd be happy to, in the Q&A, to talk about the intricacies of the respective regimes, because it's fascinating and it does provide a clue into what each thought was important. But we did send them all of this material, and then it was, of course, up to them to decide what to do with it. We were not going to make those decisions. They had to factor them into the narrative that they wanted to tell. They had to select those portions of audio that they felt were most representative of the narrative they wanted to tell. And by and large, I thought that they did a very judicious and fair job with them. Again, I'm happy to clarify more broadly. There are, of course, topics that all of us would like to have seen addressed. Bob, I know, would like to have seen a lot of other topics addressed. But as far as the tapes, I'll just point to 3 that complicate the story but don't necessarily change it all that much from what Burns and Novick and the Florentine team offered. First, with regard to JFK, there was a mention in the film of the incipient withdrawal, the possibility that JFK was looking to get out of Vietnam, to get American troops out of Vietnam by 1965. I was thrilled that it was included. It was not a part of the 1983 film, the Stanley Carnell WGBH film, certainly not to the extent that it's received attention since. And it is an important conversation. It's a conversation that has animated the literature recently. It's a conversation that the public wants to engage in. So I was thrilled that Florentine was interested in at least remarking upon it. There are some interesting conversations that shed light on that, and those were not included. But again, in many ways, I see this film as serving the kind of function that 1983 film did as well, and particularly for me. I was a senior in college at the time. And it offered a springboard to me and to others, and I believe even to Lynn, to ask more questions about Vietnam. And I think that's one of the great benefits that the film is going to provide now. It will be a springboard for further research and further questioning about the war. Regarding LBJ, I think that the guns and butter trade-off is incredibly important for Johnson. It's alluded to in the film, and I would say that the film alludes to most everything of great significance regarding the war, certainly as far as the presidents themselves were concerned. Some more context might have been helpful, and we are trying to provide that. We've been working with the Florentine team in post-production to try to provide some of this content enrichment. So if you go to the PBS site for the film, we provide some additional resources. You can hear any number of recordings free of charge through a pass-through on Kennedy and Johnson, and then on Nixon as well. And while the decent interval, the end game that Nixon and Kissinger hit upon to extricate the United States, of course it's a question as to when they hit upon this and the context in which they carried it out. It's a complex story, and I think that Ken and Lynn and the team certainly hit upon the most significant dimensions of that, but I think it is a broad story, and I would encourage anybody interested in that to avail themselves of those materials. The artistic dimension of the film, something that Mark had asked us to comment about, I thought it was extraordinary. I think it's simply stunning. And I felt that from the first time that I had a chance to see it with Tom at a post-lock screening in New York in 2015, straight up through now. I particularly like the way that they represented the recordings. I love the reel-to-reel. I like the text on the screen. I thought that was very effective. And of course, the music and the way it dovetails with the action is great. Let me say one thing about the music, and that'll lead into, I suppose, my probably final comments here. To hear Led Zeppelin and Marvin Gaye, bands and artists that you don't often hear in the Vietnam soundtrack, and that's probably because much of that soundtrack for us comes by way of Hollywood films. And I would point to not just the late 1970s, but the mid-1980s. Good Morning Vietnam, maybe the best representation of that Vietnam soundtrack. And because of the time in the war that it's representing, you won't get Zeppelin or Marvin Gaye, certainly not like that. It would have been great to have heard Jim Morrison and the Doors. And not just because it's the beginning sequence of Apocalypse Now, but because it's pretty representative of the time. But I would also point out that it would have been nice to have heard Barry Sadler and the Ballad of the Green Beret, the #1 song in 1966, to give people a better sense of the context of the time. And while in many ways Ken and Lynn and the team are offering a popular history, a people's history of the war, I think to have included music like that, and also to thread through individuals like a Bill Zimmerman or a Nancy Bieberman, anti-war activists, and there are concerns about the way that what comes out of their mouths. I also think it would have been helpful, again, to represent the era. Helpful to have heard somebody, let's say, from Young Americans for Freedom, at least have heard that person's voice threaded throughout. We certainly see placards and people supporting the troops and supporting the president, but to have heard a live flesh and blood person articulating those concerns would have been great. My personal perspective is that I want a policy history. That's what I do. That's what I'm interested in. But I recognize that that's not the story they're interested in telling. So as we go on and critique the war and the film on the war, I hope that we're able to address it on its own terms. What is it that they were trying to achieve, the stories that they were trying to tell, and as we do in the Academy, review the book that's written and not the book that we wish that person had written. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Greg Daddis. I'm the director of the Masters of Arts program in War and Society at Chapman University in Orange, California. So I'm here visiting from the left coast. Mark, thank you so much for the invitation to come out here. Sam, thanks so much for all the hard work of getting us all here. And Tom, I'm going to let you borrow my phone cover so you can know the difference with the Beatles.
Well, the Battle of the Green Beret was in, but they took it out. I started crying every time they played it.
Well,
I have somewhat responsibility for that.
okay.
So as the dust settles on this 18-hour documentary, I think we can already get a sense that it seems unlikely that long-standing debates engendered by this conflict are going to abate much in the film's aftermath. And I think, as Mark alluded to, as it so often is the case, most reviews, some of which were penned even before the first episode even aired, say more about the reviewer than the film itself. And without a doubt, when it comes to the war in Vietnam, there are plenty of hobby horses to mount. It likely will take time, I think, for Americans in particular to process this documentary. Old wounds are reopened. Death and wounding are relentless. Passionate, sometimes vulgar, voices are transposed on top of duplicity at the highest levels of government. And so if nothing else, I think this film intimately exposes its audience to the trauma of war. It seems to me, though, that there is something incredibly important not to take out of this documentary, and that is lessons. Now, at first blush, this may seem counterintuitive. A Secretary of State and U.S. Senator, John Kerry and John McCain, both veterans of the conflict, already have outlined their lessons in the Washington Post after reviewing the film. And yet, arguably, this is the least valuable way to come to grips with such a multifaceted conflict. Lessons tend to compartmentalize history, hewing off the rough edges of complex human experiences so that they can be packaged into neatly readable lists. They also reduce, if not disregard, the numerous independent and dependent variable so common in war. Looking back, do we not think of David Galula, who was a French officer in Algeria, who penned a famous 8-step procedure for winning in counterinsurgency? Doesn't that seem a bit formulaic right now? Clearly, his lessons from the French wars in Algeria and Indochina proved impractical during America's more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Historical lessons rarely play out as anticipated. Rather, to me, viewers of this saga, Americans in particular, should seek to gain a newfound perspective from this complex story. And in short, again, as Mark just alluded to, this film should start new conversations about the war rather than serve to end debate because two of our nation's finest directors have spoken. This should not be the accepted gospel on Vietnam. Now, arguably the best way to gain much needed perspective is through empathizing with the multitude of voices we hear in the film. Perhaps most importantly, the voices from those with whom we reflexively disagree. Empathy helps us fathom how competing motives drive humans to make difficult decisions, both good and bad. Empathy leads us to better appreciate why so many Vietnamese saw foreigners as invaders, and why so many Americans in the early 1960s were unwilling to question their nation's sense of exceptionalism. It helps us better grasp why Mogi Crocker and John Musgrave defined their sense of manhood through service in U.S. combat units, or why Bill Earhart pined at the chance to become a star in his own John Wayne movie. Empathy involves seeing American protesters as more than just spoiled, privileged kids, to considering that deserter Jack Todd, that he might actually be more courageous by heading to Canada than Tim O'Brien, who instead deployed reluctantly to Vietnam. It forces us to wrestle with the uncomfortable proposition from both U.S. Marine Carl Merlantes and North Vietnamese soldier Nguyen Ngoc that there can, in fact, be a savage joy to combat. And yes, empathy even can prompt fresh questions, asking whether senior U.S. leaders like Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara were indeed shaped, in George Kennan's words, by illusions of invincibility on our part. After these grueling 18 hours, we might also ask ourselves if we agree with journalist Neil Sheehan's supposition that far too many Americans feel as if history doesn't apply to them. Now, of course, seeking perspective from history does not mean you must agree with the decision of these historical actors or the narrative choices made by Ken Burns and Lynn Novak. Even as an advisor to the film, I left the film feeling that the writers had vastly oversimplified U.S. strategy and unjustly reduced its objectives to the well-worn tropes of attrition and body count. I agree with Bob Sorley that as the film nears its end, Creighton Abrams becomes a snapshot at best. Others were likely frustrated by the Saigon government being painted as little more than a corrupt band of thieves. And still others might question why then young military officers are the ones speaking on decision-making at the highest levels of government, either in Hanoi or in Washington, D.C. Is the former Marine, Carl Merlantes, who went to Vietnam in 1969, for instance, best equipped to speak on the inner workings of the Johnson White House? Still, any displeasure with a director's choices should not lead to handy checklists of lessons. Viewers should resist temptations to view the documentary simply as an indictment of those with whom they disagree. Such an approach leads, to me, inappropriately, to an if-only fabrication of history. If only Americans had found a better leader than Ngo Dinh Diem. If only LBJ had allowed his military officers to expand the war into Laos and Cambodia. If only the anti-war movement had been silenced. If only our media had been more patriotic. If only Americans could have won their war. Yet war, not just the one in Vietnam, but war more generally, rarely accords to such simple counterfactuals. War is intended to be chaotic, traumatic, and yes, horrific. Some might rightly see it as an organic, ever-evolving entity that too often breaks free from the control of the humans who unleash it. Few assumptions rarely play out as expected in war. So to me, what's been most surprising is that in the end, these 18 hours are in fact hardly enough time to fully embrace the complexity of the multiple wars, plural, both home and abroad, that engulfed Southeast Asia and the United States for much of the Cold War era. So if Americans failed to question some of their deeply held assumptions on that war and what war more generally could achieve for them in the 1960s, perhaps it's time for all of us to do so now. A checklist of lessons won't get us there, but perhaps seeking a sense of historical perspective will. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nguyen Tran. I teach history at the University of Connecticut. My own specialization is in Southeast Asian history, with specifically Vietnam, and I was asked to sort of give a perspective from Vietnam studies, so that is what I will proceed to do. So I very much appreciate the inclusion of Vietnamese voices in this documentary. I think that is fairly new, not completely new, but fairly new for American media representations of the war. Yet, despite this inclusion of new perspectives, I would argue that the documentary was in some ways quite conventional and somewhat, at times it felt cliche to me. And I want to sort of explore what that is. So I would argue, from what I picked up, that the documentary has two main storylines. The first storyline is a story about American loss of innocence, disillusionment, and the enduring conflicts in American society. The second storyline, which I'll get in a little bit more in detail later, is a story about a conflict between the United States and communist Vietnamese nationalists. This story in the documentary begins with a partnership between Ho Chi Minh and the OSS in 1945. The relationship eventually turns to war, and then this storyline ends with normalization and reconciliation in the 1990s. But both of these storylines are actually fairly conventional. They represent the dominant scholarship on the war as this two-dimensional conflict between the United States and Vietnam. But I would argue that the whole point of including new Vietnamese voices isn't just to supplement the interpretation we have. It should be to test those interpretations and consider new ones. So let me break that down a little further. So the documentary uses interviews to represent the four main belligerents in the war: the United States, North Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, usually referred to as South Vietnam, and the NLF, known to most Americans as the Viet Cong. But the storyline, despite the fact that it talks about these four belligerents, the storyline is really about the war between North Vietnam and the US. That is, a conflict between communist nationalism and American anti-communism. So the perspective of the NLF and the Saigon regime, the RVN, is we don't really get their interpretations of the war. They're not fully developed. So what that means is we have the northern Vietnamese, but we don't have the southern Vietnamese voices on either the communist or the anti-communist side. And I want to talk about a little more why I think that matters. So the NLF, even though the NLF was created on orders by Hanoi, we also know as researchers that the NLF was motivated by local grievances against the Saigon government. We know through interviews from defectors done during the war that the NLF was not just fighting for national liberation, but also for social and economic changes. If you look at the program of the NLF in 1960, there's an array of economic and social demands that have nothing to do with nationalism. So where are the interviews that express this interpretation of the war, that these social and economic demands? On the side of the Republic of Vietnam, the RVN, the Saigon government, so the movie really, I could not find the moment where the movie really explains what the war meant to this side, but other than not liking communism. But there's no explanation why. If you look at Vietnamese writing from the RVN beginning in the mid-50s, what you're going to find is that many anti-communist nationalists in the RVN believed that this conflict was a struggle of a nationalist struggle against communism. And some of these narratives, many of them, will remember 1945 not as a moment of Vietnamese-American partnership, but as the beginning of this rupture between communists and anti-communists. Where are the interviews expressing this perspective? And I would point out that one of the people they interviewed, the former South Vietnamese ambassador, Bù Yim, has actually written a memoir in which he talks about the mid-1940s. So it's not that the filmmakers couldn't find someone. They found someone, they just either didn't talk to him about it or they didn't show us the clippings of them talking about it. So the purpose of the inclusion of these new voices, I would argue, should have been to shed light on some of these alternative perspectives, on these other interpretations. This would have resulted in a richer, more multidimensional of the conflict as a war between four belligerents. My second major critique of the documentary is the use of interviews. I understand that the filmmakers chose not to interview experts, but only historical witnesses. To me, one of the purposes of talking to historical witnesses is to understand how they experienced an event and how that experience of an event leads them to a particular interpretation of that event. But what I found is that many of the interviews, at least the ones that I could see as the viewer, was either about people's opinions, so their interpretations, or about their experiences. But there wasn't a lot of linking between the two. And so parts of the documentary actually sound like an opinion poll rather than testimonies from witnesses. So I felt that quite weakened the storyline because it didn't give the sort of dramatic tension or dramatic narrative where this is how I felt and this is why these experiences led me to feel this way. A related problem was choosing appropriate interviews. So for example, during the portrayal of the Kent State shootings, there are several interviews with people who were horrified by the shootings. And then the voiceover tells us that the majority of Americans at the time thought the shootings were justified. Where are the interviews that explain that perspective? Regardless of whether or not we agree with that perspective is important for understanding or getting a historical snapshot of that time. When they covered the massacre in Hue in 1968 during the Tet Offensive, there are interviews with North Vietnamese veterans. As a viewer, I wasn't sure if those North Vietnamese veterans were actually there, or they heard about it, or what their relationship was with the event. When the filmmaker covers the My Lai massacre, there are interviews with Tim O'Brien and other Americans. And Tim O'Brien says, the peasants in that area, they were very different. I couldn't understand why. But what was missing was interviews with survivors, with victims, with people who, if not themselves witnessed it, their family or friends did in the general area. So I think our first duty when we talk about atrocities and we're using multiple perspectives is that we need to prioritize the voices of the victims, not the perpetrators and the bystanders. So that, for me, was a mind-boggling decision. And I think I'm out of time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mark, again, thank you very much for having us up here. I feel honored to be on a panel with all these august scholars. So I'll try to make my speech quick, because I know most of you are ready to fall asleep about this point. So the staggering complexity of the Vietnam War really has resisted any conclusive definition of what precisely the war was about. Much like physics, we still have no grand unified theory among either scholars or the public. Perhaps the sheer scope and breadth of that long conflict prevents an easy explanation. It's colonialism and nationalism and ideology and civil war sort of all intertwined to create this historical facsimile of the proverbial Gordian knot. Yeah, among us, we can all command a dizzying array of facts about the war or fervently believe in historical truths, yet remain surprisingly uninformed. Worse, even possessing intimate knowledge of the war often leads to disdain for other viewpoints, rejecting even the slightest opening to contrary perspectives. Such divides long ago hardened into competing views, with each side unfortunately viewing its perspective as canon and the other side as heretical. So, having heard both Burns and Novick speak, I understand that their documentary hoped to bridge that divide and spark healing among these factions. According to Mr. Burns, they sought neutrality to, in his words, only call balls and strikes. Perhaps seeking middle ground was the best approach, as undoubtedly most people watching, especially those with specialized knowledge of the war or did not live through those times, will view the series as magisterial. I suspect, however, that much like the 1983 effort, those invested in a particular political viewpoint will not be pleased with the outcome. Each side, both left and right, wants vindication instead of being forced to accept alternative facts. And my review of several hundred news articles and commentaries about the film seems to confirm my misgivings. So I'm sort of reminded of the old biblical phrase, because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. So if Burns and Novick sought fairness, then it behooves the rest of us to also only call balls and strikes on their 10-year effort. So in my view, the filmmakers are to be commended for creating an amazing movie, one that covers the war's scope. More importantly, they sought to out numerous sides, from both young men who answered a country's call to others who became draft resistors. Yet even with an exhausting 18 hours, and it was exhausting, in many ways it is a lengthy redundancy, repeating old stories and unchallenging surface realities. The war was never black and white, but shades of gray reflecting multiple degrees of truth. Naturally focused on the American experience, the series portrays how the United States entered the war and its effect upon servicemen and their suffering families and upon American society and government. The film also represents those who resisted it, and while the series appears to take umbrage at some anti-war protest, one senses an understated yet pervasive anti-war sentiment from the filmmakers. In many clips, one sees protesters waving Viet Cong flags, yet the commentator never remarks on this obvious absurdity. Most U.S. veterans shown, in my opinion, perhaps because their involvement spanned a substantial portion of the war, seem chosen solely to provide authentic voices from those who became opposed to the war. Yet rarely do we see American veterans who are proud of their service and did not believe the war was a mistake. It seems disingenuous to me to portray one Marine through a major part of the series, only to learn near the end that he eventually joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Moreover, while accurate to highlight flawed American battle tactics, such as taking a hill at great cost only to subsequently retreat, it does not provide a corresponding view of successful battles that drove off enemy units. It seems that only the negative was accentuated, mainly to provide the unspoken thesis of the war as a costly mistake. To support that implicit narrative, there seems an overt cherry-picking of White House tapes from both the Johnson and Nixon eras. If on multiple instances both presidents were taped clearly outlining their policies to help the South Vietnamese, but on occasion lapsed into doubt, and only the doubts are broadcast, what does that say about the motivation of the directors? I once asked Dr. Kissinger specifically about the comment heard in the film that no one will care about Vietnam in a year. He observed to me that U.S. officials and policymakers are human also, subject to the same doubts and fatigues as others, and hence liable to express frustration at an intractable problem. Yet, when shown in isolation, it is portrayed as a cynical comment revealing Kissinger and Nixon's true feeling rather than one remark among many. Commendably, the film was translated into Vietnamese, is being shown online in that country. The film provides voices from their side, often measured on occasion, willing if somewhat grudgingly to admit past mistakes. However, it required Huy Duc, a young journalist, to speak more plainly than the others. Oddly, I noticed that, according to one news article, the Vietnamese government's response has been muted, with only the foreign ministry making a bland statement that they hoped the filmmakers would understand that the war was a righteous revolution that mobilized the entire nation. In my opinion, the film's most egregious flaw is the unflattering view of the nationalist or South Vietnamese voice, who are portrayed almost continually as corrupt, authoritarian, and cowardly. These have become, in my opinion, code words meant to delegitimize a country and her people, making them not worth fighting or dying for. South Vietnam certainly had those elements, but also many positive accomplishments that were never mentioned. South Vietnam was unquestionably flawed, and we can easily enumerate those faults, but it was a relatively free country and struggling to become a democracy while concurrently fighting an implacable enemy that used terrorism to achieve its aims. It is a clever editorial trick to use South Vietnamese to criticize their own former government. This, however, is an easy accomplishment, as the South Vietnamese even today remain riven by faction and incessant backbiting. If truly designed to be neutral, then why was there no corresponding voice discussing Saigon's many accomplishments like land reform, or that thousands of enemy soldiers left their own ranks to join the South Vietnamese in their program known as Chu Hoi? For example, we are told that Party Secretary Le Duan launched the 68th offensive because he believed the South Vietnamese military would quickly collapse and the South Vietnamese people would rise and take to the streets to overthrow their government. We have provided numerous interviews with communist soldiers and cadre who fought during the battle and admitted this did not occur. Yet only at the end does the commentator acknowledge that the ARVN fought well and that the civilians did not rise up, although he claims they simply hid in their houses. Such begrudging afterthoughts are, as the daughter of a prominent South Vietnamese general remarked to me, are like a rifle butt to the heart. Ultimately, I believe that despite a valiant effort, this was at best an imperfect effort to tell an extraordinarily complex story. At worst, it has cemented, perhaps forever, unfortunately, the old stereotypes. The U.S. as bumbling interlopers layering mistakes upon bad judgment and governmental deceit, the communists as ardent nationalists simply trying to unify their country, and the Southerners as corrupt incompetence not worth the lives of American men. The film serves as a stark reminder that in war, truth is the first casualty. Thank you.
Thank you. So for those who have seen some of the interviews that preceded the series, Burns, I think, made fairly clear that he felt that the country had done veterans a disservice by how they were treated when they came back, and he wants to support the troops without supporting the war. And I think if you look at how the veterans are treated, I think that is where some of the strengths of the production lie. The American veterans, I think, are treated more fairly than they have been in some productions. You get to see the patriotic motives that drove many of them. There are quite a few veterans who take issue with the depiction of veterans as being deranged baby killers. We do have some South Vietnamese veterans included, as Nguyen mentioned, but again, I think there's problems in terms of what they're actually saying. But the very fact that they're included was, I think, a step forward. I have more problems with how the war itself is handled. Some of these have already been covered, so I won't cover them all for the sake of brevity. And I would point out there are a few things that are good that were not in similar type productions before. We get, I think, a more sober view of the Vietnamese communists. We do hear early on about Ho Chi Minh's true Communist Party affiliations, about how he was pulling the strings of the so-called National Liberation Front from the beginning. There are some brief references to how there was actually democracy in South Vietnam, but these are very small pieces in a big story. And I think, for the most part, the storyline is quite similar to what we saw in the last PBS mega series, Vietnam: A Television History, which aired in 1983. In terms of the military side, there are lots of battle scenes. And one thing that most people aren't going to know is that he very much cherry-picked the battle scenes where the Americans had the most difficulty, which were actually quite small in number, and same thing with the South Vietnamese. And so I think you can, from the troops' perspective, I think they would view it sort of like a football team that won most of their games, tied a few, maybe lost a couple, but somebody decided to do a video about them and just focused on those few ties and defeats. So I think it's going to be very hard to convince veterans that he's actually supporting the troops, given how he portrays the way that they fought. There's also, reference has been made to the fact that a lot of these veterans are sort of disillusioned as they come through, and we see time and again how there's battles where you have one or two Americans telling the story, and they just show how bad things are going. People are killed and wounded, and then at the end they talk about how they became disillusioned. And Jay's made reference to this a bit already, but there was a survey after the war that found that 90% of Vietnam veterans said they were glad to have served in Vietnam, and 69% said they enjoyed their time there. But we don't hear that in the interviews. We get a lot of Vietnam veterans against the war who were at most 1% of the population, but about a third of the people who were interviewed are actually part of that or similar organizations. Another interesting finding of that Veterans Administration survey was that 92% of veterans agreed with this statement. The trouble in Vietnam was that our troops were asked to fight in a war which our political leaders in Washington would not let them win. And this is another subject we almost never hear in the on-camera interviews because it doesn't fit the narrative of the unwinnable war. We don't hear about the bitter disputes in Washington over whether U.S. ground forces should have been used in Laos or North Vietnam, or about the later acknowledgement from the communist side that these measures actually could have changed the war. Again, I think our South Vietnamese allies, America's South Vietnamese allies, are particularly poorly treated in terms of how they're portrayed. The Strategic Hamlet program, which I think was actually successful in many respects, according to the documentary, actually self-imploded because the population was so alienated. But if you actually look at what the communists said, it was hurting them quite a bit until the American-sponsored coup of November 1963. The great improvement we see in the South Vietnamese forces after the Tet Offensive receives almost no mention at all. We don't hear much about the strategic rationale for the war. There's a mention of the domino theory at the beginning, but then it kind of disappears, and so you don't know that in 1965 that most of Asia is calling for American intervention, or that the Vietnam intervention actually influenced events in the critical country of Indonesia. Also, given our interest here in history, I want to highlight historical perspective because I think it would be useful to look at that. If you look at what's in the film and then also some of the comments, one of the big indictments is that American presidents Johnson and Nixon and Kennedy all lied about it, and they did lie about it. But if you look back through history, Lincoln lied about the Civil War, and Woodrow Wilson about World War I, Franklin Roosevelt about World War II. So, and yet we don't question the validity of those wars. The other historical point I would mention is, we talk about, there's repeated references to the corruption and ineffectiveness of the South Vietnamese. And certainly, you could make a case that they were not as effective as the North Vietnamese. But you could have said the same thing about South Korea or Taiwan a short time earlier, and yet, but because we stuck with them, those countries were able to survive, and they are now prosperous, vibrant countries, whereas their adversaries are repressive dictatorships. So I will leave my comments there, so we have plenty of time for discussion. Do want to also extend a welcome to Senator Warner. Sir, thank you for joining us here. It's a privilege to have you. So I'll turn it back over to Eric.
All right, I have a couple of questions here that we received through Twitter, and if you have questions, go ahead and give it to the person who's coming around, and I will get those. So the first question, thank you, comes from Scott W. Johnson via Twitter, and he writes, "The documentary was still describing the conflict as a civil war in episode 10, as North Vietnamese tanks walked or rolled into Saigon. What gives?" Now let me extend a little on that. I think I know what he's talking about. So I think the question is, was South Vietnam actually a state? Was it a nation? Was it a country? Because I think the point of the question is, if you define civil war as a war between the people in South Vietnam, then it does seem a little funny to have T-54s, from North Vietnam. So what do we mean by civil war? Is it truly a Vietnamese thing? And I guess the question that I'll give to the panel is, was South Vietnam actually a state? Was it a nation? And in what way can we talk about that? Anyone who'd like to?
Actually, Eric, can you read a couple just so we?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, and a second question that we have comes from Rick Hunter, again on Twitter, and he writes, "Didn't the fall of South Vietnam to the communists in 1975 validate why we'd been there in the first place?" Which I think gets to sort of the question of we knew that was the objective of the communists. That's why we're there. So why are we debating whether it was a worthwhile experience? And let's see, I have a third question here. Okay, this is from our audience, and I'm just going to read this here. And this is to anyone. Despite conflicting views over the war in Iraq and what has happened since, today society expresses universal support for the troops and the veterans in contrast to the feelings during the Vietnam War. What do you think accounts for the differences in the feelings? What changed in terms of the motivations people back then expressed, at least some of them, so much animus towards the veterans, and that is no longer true? What were the factors that explain that change in our society?
I'll take a crack at the Civil War, issue. You know, the United States goes to war in Vietnam to create South Vietnam. South Vietnam is why we go. We go to Vietnam to create an alternative to the communists, and our whole strategy is based on let's build the nation, let's build South Vietnam as a nation. I think that's what Mark was referring to when they said, you know, that's why we go. This enterprise is to create South Vietnam. That's what we're trying to do. I think there's a debate in the film about how well South Vietnam does that. You know, how skillful is Ngo Dinh Diem? And I think the film portrays fairly the complications in South Vietnam's own politics of how it develops itself. I mean, I think it's hard to develop a nation. I think if you want to compare it to South Korea, I think Park Chung-hee was just really much better at it than Ngo Dinh Diem was. I think, unlike South Korea, the French had been there previously. When South Vietnam tries to get created, it still gets tainted. It still gets tainted with colonialism. It still gets tainted with the French occupation. The French colonial system is still there. And so when South Vietnam tries to develop, they don't completely shed the French connection. And I think Diem himself, the French don't like Diem. Diem tries to get rid of it. I think Diem tries pretty hard to get rid of it. So I think Vietnam is a civil war and a war of national liberation. It is both. It is, you know, and I think in the film we try to make sure that both are represented. And I think we took, at least on the Vietnam participant side, Huy Duc says it's more of a civil war than when Nop says it's more of a traditional war of liberation. And that's what they argue about in the film. And I think both sides of whether it's a civil war or a war of national liberation and survival are both represented in the film. The complication is how the United States and South Vietnam together try to create a nation, and that experiment doesn't do very well.
Any of the three questions? I'm just going to go down. Oh, you go ahead.
May I address the first question? Okay. So I want to start by saying that a civil war and a war of national liberation are not somehow mutually exclusive. A conflict can be both. I would argue that what we see in Vietnam, if we take it over the long span, is this conflict with kind of three dimensions to it. One of them is a war against colonialism. One of them is a war between Vietnamese, the Civil War aspect of it, and the third one is the Cold War aspect of it. If we go back to 1945 and take it all the way between 1945 and 1975, what we're going to see in 1945 is there is no Vietnamese state. There is a colonial state that was under Japanese occupation. After Japan surrenders at the end of World War II, there are multiple Vietnamese groups trying to seize power. The ones who succeed is the Viet Minh, a communist-led nationalist movement. But they're not the only group, and when they seize power, the other groups are also trying to seize power. So what we should think about the way we should think about this are these are all aspiring states. All of them think that they speak for the Vietnamese people. All of them are trying to lay claim to the entire territory of what was once the three easternmost parts of French Indochina. So it's not that anyone, I don't believe, looking at the sources, in South Vietnam, it's not anyone thought that their nation was only the southern half. If you look at geography textbooks from the north and the south, they will show the exact same map. So it's not, I do not think it's a question of whether South Vietnam was a state, as much as how these are competing aspiring states, and one is definitely more successful than the other. And this conflict is one between communists and anti-communists that predate American involvement, and it outlasts American involvement. In that sense, I think it is very much a conflict between Vietnamese.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, and I'm not going to add much because I think that's really well said. One of the ways that I have been thinking about this, and I'm hardly the only one who's done so, Ed Miller at Dartmouth has done wonderful work on this, is to think of what transpired as the challenge of sovereignty. That what we have here are competing sovereignties. That stretch back to 1945 and extend through the French War and up through the 1950s. And the development of the war and the respective positions, it turns on who can provide the most compelling case for the sovereign Vietnam. And for me, focusing on that concept has been very helpful.
And if I could link this discussion, which was wonderful, to I think the third question on 1975 validating U.S. entry, I think we should all be careful with that, because what it does, I think, is it presupposes that that history, the larger history, I would argue, of the Cold War is static from 1945 to 1975. And I think we should ask ourselves why South Vietnam was as important to the Johnson administration as it wasn't as important to the Nixon administration. That the context of the Cold War is changing between the Nixon and Johnson administrations. And we should ask ourselves why Nixon and Kissinger felt that South Vietnam was no longer as important as it was to the United States in the larger Cold War context in 1970 as it might have been in 1964 or 1965 when President Johnson was making decisions to send in ground combat troops. So I think we just need to be careful of thinking about this time period where the Cold War is static, and that thus validates what happens in 1975 to decisions that are made in 1970 or 1965 or 1960, because I'm just not sure that's accurate.
The question was raised as to what's different with Iraq and Afghanistan as compared to the Vietnam War, I guess in two ways, attitudes toward those who are serving in the war and toward the validity of the war itself. The two obvious things that suggest themselves are these. In the Vietnam War, that war was fought partly by drafted soldiers, sailors, and so on. Whereas now it's fought, these current battles are fought entirely by volunteers. We all know that, of course. The other obvious thing is that the importance and the value of fighting the war in Vietnam was never as dramatically apparent in the United States as it has been in these more recent conflicts. We used to have a World Trade Center. We don't have one anymore. It went away, and we know why it went away. So those are important differences. I do think, and this refers to the film, I do think it's important to state that the war was not, as we may have been given to understand, fought primarily by unwilling draftees from the lower economic stratum. Most people don't seem to know this, but the Veterans Administration documents it. Unlike the so-called greatest generation of World War II, which was composed 1/3 of volunteers and 2/3 of draftees, the Army of the Vietnam era was just the opposite. 2/3 volunteers, 1/3 draftees. So there's an interesting and important difference that needs to be more emphasized in the record.
let me build on what Greg was saying about the stakes. So 1965, if you look at what's going on in Southeast Asia, there are all sorts of indications that China and North Vietnam are working together to spread communism. There's actually not much in the film about the Tito thesis, that Ho Chi Minh was the next Tito, which is interesting. But we now know China is actually putting hundreds of thousands of troops into North Vietnam, and so we can't never know exactly what would have happened if we'd pulled out. But there was strong reason to believe that American withdrawal would have caused the dominoes to fall. And the most important domino, if you look at the time, what people were saying, was Indonesia, which I don't think is ever mentioned. I don't think that word appears in the whole series. But there's a coup at the end of 1965, which I think was heavily influenced by what happened in Vietnam, which reverses the tide there. Now, the film shows George F. Kennan in 66 or 67 talking about, well, maybe our rationale isn't as much there. And a big part of his argument was, well, now we've saved Indonesia, maybe Vietnam's not as important anymore. And others have made that case. But I think the president felt, once you send in 300,000 American troops, it's pretty hard to pull them out quickly. And so that is why, when you get to the Nixon and Kissinger, you also then have China in the throes of the Cultural Revolution. You have the Soviet Union becoming the closest ally of North Vietnam, and this falling out. So there is a legitimate case to be made that America's interest in Vietnam had declined because the Southeast Asia as a whole was moving favorably.
Let me say that I've been getting tons of great questions, and if I may be so bold, I may prevail on Mark and the rest of them. If we can't cover all of the questions now, to give them a little homework, so we do cover everybody's question. I'm going to do my best to I'm sort of organizing them into themes, but if we can't get them all done today, we will get them done, because this is important.
Are you grading our homework or no?
Yes, no. My graduate school grading days are done. Thank you. But they're sort of coming in themes. And here's one theme, and I'll read the two questions. And this is, I think, from in the room. Doesn't say who it is, but the question is, I noticed the documentary only dealt briefly with other countries fighting in the war on the American side, like South Korea and Australia. Is this a significant omission, or did they make only a minor contribution? And the second, which I feel is kind of a related question, comes from Jack Hurley, who is in the audience. While there was reference to SCAG and as existing, there's no reference made to the definition, the Saigon Civil Assistance Group, an element of CORDS, which is a major part of pacification, MACV's pacification support. So the question here is, that seems to be an omission. So let me put it to you, the panelists, this way. Given that there's 18 hours, that's it, no more. You got to cut something to put something in. So what's missing? And do answer those specific questions, but along those lines, and what would you cut out? But specifically, let's talk about the Free World Allies and other organizations like CORDS and stuff, if anyone would like to take that.
I guess I can.
Okay.
Good.
Well, certainly the Australians did a fantastic job cleaning out Phuoc Tuy province down in the south, but that was a relatively minor sideshow. The Koreans, I think, were quite significant in the Central Highlands. They held the coast, and we can talk about whether they had more atrocities than us, but they enabled the Americans to move in the Central Highlands. So the two South Korean divisions that were there were extremely significant in terms of holding the very key coastal central part of the Central Highlands.
I can talk a little bit about CORDS because I do think it is an important storyline. Neither Robert Comer nor William Kobe, who both directed CORDS since from its inception in March of 1967 through the end of the war, or at least Kobe till 72, right? 72, Kobe?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Is that Colby 72, right, is when he went home?
Yeah.
That I think it is an important...
71, maybe 71.
Yeah.
My daughter was ill.
That's right, yeah. Thank you. I do think it is an important consideration for all of us to think about that. My estimation, based on the readings of the documents, is that American strategy was always more comprehensive than what we've come to see, that the cliches of attrition and crossover point and body count are convenient shorthands, but I'm not sure that they embrace the complexity of the American approach to Vietnam. And I think we need to be careful about kind of looking back to the past with a sense of hubris. And the reason I say that is when we describe American strategy as just being this narrow-minded attempt at achieving crossover point through body counts, what it suggests is that if only those in the past were smarter than us, because clearly we can see it now, then we would have won the war. Americans would have helped win the war. And I think we need to take care with that and perhaps give those in the past some credit. My studies have found that American officers understood that this was just as much a political war as it was a military war, that they did their best to try and integrate efforts at revolutionary development or nation building or pacification or civic action, and there was a problem because all these words get jumbled up together. But there was, in fact, a good faith effort through much of the American experience in Vietnam to do just that, to try and link the local population to the central government in Saigon. And I think that's an important story for us because what it suggests is that even if Americans were as comprehensive as they were, and I think they were, in their approach to the political and military problems in Vietnam, and still failed, that tells us a very different story than the Americans lost because they were just narrowly focused on body counts and attrition. And I think the problems with pacification and the implementation of accords are fully worth our attention. Because too oftentimes the political and the military are working at cross purposes with each other. And those are incredibly relevant questions for us to ask today in American military endeavors abroad. How do you balance military operations, which need to happen because, in fact, we are at war, with other non-military functions, whether it be some semblance of nation building or pacification or working on behalf of the population to help build a stable and legitimate local government. And that's an incredibly difficult proposition, both today as it was in the 1960s. And I think it's important for us to consider that portion of the story because I think that's where we can again, gain some important and relevant perspective from the American experience in Vietnam.
So those comments by Professor Dottis are very useful because they highlight a major omission in this film, which is that there was a dramatic shift or change or difference between the first years of American involvement in Vietnam, when the LBJ administration is in power and we have Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, and then we have Maxwell Taylor, and then we have Lodge again as our ambassador in Vietnam, and we have General Westmoreland as our commander there. And the later years, when we have Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, well, we have the Nixon administration, Ellsworth Bunker, Abrams as commander, and Colby in charge of the pacification program. In the earlier years, as Professor Dottis pointed out, it's a war of attrition. Westmoreland chooses that, and he's not repentant about that. He says so in his memoirs. And here's something that highlights that, again, most people don't seem to realize. In both the earlier and the later periods, the American commander in Vietnam had pretty much carte blanche as to how he wanted to fight the war within South Vietnam. You know, we've heard about, the Tuesday lunches and choosing the bombing targets, and so on. But those are in North Vietnam. And of course, they're the sanctuaries provided the enemy in Laos and Cambodia that we all know about. But within South Vietnam, the commander could pretty much fight the war the way he chose. Westmoreland's way to fight the war was to have a war of attrition in which the tactical approach was search and destroy, and the metric or measure of merit was body count. And he apparently believed that if he could kill enough of the enemy, the North Vietnamese communists would lose heart, cease their aggression against the South, and go home. And in order to achieve that, he kept asking for more and more and more U.S. forces. And for a long time, he got them. He got up to 543,400, well over 500,000 at the high water point. But beginning in '67, and in the administration and in the larger body politic, there were many voices raised against this approach, as there were within his command in Vietnam. General Fred Wyand, a good example, but there are many examples of people in Vietnam who said this isn't working, it's not going to work, and it cannot work. And one of the main reasons was set forth in a study done under the auspices of a little-known general, Harold K. Johnson, who was Chief of Staff of the Army during the same 4 years Westmoreland commanded in Vietnam. His study was called PROVEN, short for Program for the Pacification and Long-Term Development of South Vietnam. And it said very clearly, what Westmoreland is doing is not working, and it cannot work, and the reason is it has no impact on the covert infrastructure that the enemy has in place, especially in the rural hamlets and villages of South Vietnam, where through terror and coercion, they have the populace under their domination. Well, the other big change between the earlier period and the later period is during the earlier period, ramping up, until finally in '67, Westmoreland asked for 200,000 more troops, and he gets a small fragment of that. And then, after claiming a great victory at Tet 68, he asked for 206,000 more troops, and that somehow just didn't compute. For years, he lied about that. Finally, about 1986, he admits to some newsman, well, yes, he said, General Wheeler, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Wheeler persuaded me to ask for those troops. But one of the things illustrated by these two periods, and in the later period, as we all know, but it's not very much emphasized in the film, instead of the build up, we have decrements, 14 increments of decrements, U.S. forces taken out, and it is shown in the film that by the time we get to 72 Easter Offensive, I think they say we have only 60,000 U.S. troops left. That's from 543,400 at the high water mark, and that very few of them were combat troops. I think there may have been one maneuver battalion left, as they were called. But here's the other thing that's really important here. I know I'm going on a little too long here, but just give me another minute. It's extremely important to understand that both sides in this conflict were totally dependent on external sources for the means of making war. The North Vietnamese were supported by, of course, Communist China and the Soviet Union, and sometimes other Warsaw Pact nations. And the South Vietnamese were totally dependent on us. So we leave. End of March 1973, we got our prisoners back, we got all our troops out, and we have promised the South Vietnamese, if they'll sign the Paris Accords, that we will continue to support them. We say if the North Vietnamese continue or resume aggression, we will punish them militarily. That means bring back the B-52s. We don't do it. We say if there's renewed fighting, we will replace on a one-for-one basis the losses of major combat systems. That's things like artillery pieces and aircraft and tanks and so on. Guess what? As provided for in the Paris Accords, we don't do that. And we say we will continue to provide robust financial support for the foreseeable future. So when the Congress decides in its wisdom, we've got all our troops out, we've got all our prisoners back, now they want to save money. So they cut by a third what we had provided the South Vietnamese the year before, and then another decrement of the same amount the next year. And so by the time we get to the 75 offensive, the South Viet forces are on short rations indeed. Our final chief of station, Saigon, named Tom Polgar, says in his final message, this was quoted in the film, it's the war's over, it's lost. But what they didn't say was, Polgar says, outcome no longer in doubt because the South Vietnamese cannot continue without our support so long as the North Vietnamese continue to get robust support from their communist patrons. End of message. And that's end of the war. So thanks to the United States Congress, but
Well, Congress is popular.
so, well, we threw, the voters threw most of those guys out the next time around, but too late then.
That's actually where I wanted to pick up, because the reference to the Tuesday Lunch Group and CORDS as an institution that was created to help manage elements of this war raised the question of how policy was made. And it's an implicit question that is explicit at times in the film. And I think one of the opportunities for us going forward, and I know that the intention of the filmmakers was to provoke these kinds of conversations, is about how policy gets made generally. And one of those institutions that I think we can focus on more going forward is Congress. It is not a major part of the film. It comes in at various points and then it leaves. It's certainly there in August of 1964 surrounding the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It's there a little bit in 1966 when we're thinking about the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings. It's slightly there in allusions in 1967 to the Stennis hearings. But one of those moments of silence is actually just before Johnson decides to Americanize the war. And in May of 1965, there's the question of an appropriation, a supplemental appropriation that Johnson is looking for, not only for Vietnam, but for the Dominican Republic. And there were 20 to 30,000 U.S. Marines that went into the Dominican Republic, April, May 1965. And there are some very interesting conversations that LBJ has with McNamara and Bundy about the propriety of engaging Congress in a conversation about what is probably about to happen, and that Westmoreland makes more explicit on June 7th, 65, when he asks for those 44 battalions. And we know what will happen as a result of that. But here's LBJ and McNamara and his awesome foursome, including McGeorge Bundy and Dean Rusk, thinking about whether they should engage Congress in a conversation about drastically changing the terms of the American engagement in Vietnam. And they decide, and it's basically LBJ deciding, that he will not go to Congress. He talks to Mansfield, he'll talk to Fulbright, but he puts them on the spot. Do you really want to think about this? Do you want to open it up again? We've basically addressed it in August of 1964. You told me what you want to do, and now with this $700 million appropriation, not only are we supporting the truth, but you're saying you are supporting the policy. And Johnson decides not to go back to Congress, even though in early July of 65, he and McNamara speak about this and say, we know among ourselves, we had never intended to put in the number of troops we're now considering based upon the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So as we think about key questions and implications that the film offers to us, we should think about how policy gets made going forward. Talk about the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force. Who should get involved in the making of American foreign policy? And what is the appropriate posture for the United States in the world? I think those are questions that the film raises. And I would encourage you to continue to pursue those, perhaps even availing yourselves of the White House tapes to hear how it was done in the past.
Yeah, I want to comment on CORDS. I actually was talking about CORDS this morning. USAID had their Global Innovation Week right now, and they had asked me to talk about defense and development, because that's something I've looked at in other contexts, but we actually talked about chords because that is still seen as one of the relatively few examples of where we use development and defense together in reasonable harmony. And a lot of that, I think, was that we basically forced the civilians kicking and screaming to fit within this military organization. They didn't like it, but it actually, I think, worked out pretty well and didn't allow them to go do their own little thing without worrying about what other people thought. I'm right now working on history of Vietnam, sequel to my earlier book, and I'm happy to be in 1967 when they're talking about forming chords. And one of the most interesting comments from Ambassador Bunker, and he says, this chords thing is, nice, and we will kind of clean ourselves up, but what really matters in pacification is the Vietnamese, and no matter how well organized we are, we're only advisors, and it's going to depend on the Vietnamese. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but one aspect that really doesn't get covered, which I think deserves to be covered, is the evolution of the South Vietnamese governmental leadership, aside from the top level. From 1960 and 61, when the Viet Cong get going, the South Vietnamese leaders not performing very well. There's a big turnaround in 1962, which is, I think, well documented. And that is the result of Diem being able to put in younger officers who are less close to the French colonial legacy. And 62, 63, you see a big shift in the war. After the coup at end of 63, there's massive purges, which aren't referenced. There's a reference about how things don't get better as we had thought, but from 64 to 67, they were living through the aftermath of that. And in 68, partly because of the Tet Offensive and how it galvanized the South Vietnamese, we start to see a turnaround in the quality of the South Vietnamese leadership. And they're not, there's still imperfections, but there are wholesale differences among these periods that are worth keeping in mind.
All right, I was expecting this, and indeed the Molotov cocktail has been put on my desk. I was a little surprised, in fact, we hadn't gotten there sooner, but we are here. So, Twitter user Rick Rios asks, what was the real effect of the press on the outcome of the war?
I'll take a crack at that. I think first of all, as a group of, if we're talking about the Americans, as a group of people, I think the American press distinguishes themselves in the Vietnam War. I think they create a lot of the original narrative of the war. There was complete access. I think the film depicts how it's easy for a reporter to go along with the Marines or the Army, and I think the journalism of the war, I think, follows elite American politics. I don't think the journalists. I think they push the war policy in the news. But I don't think they get so far out in front of it that they dominate the policy operation. I was once talking to Neil Sheehan, and I was, telling him how impressed I was with A Bright Shining Lie and in his book, and the journalists in general. He said, we never went too far. Someone else owns the newspaper, and someone else, always has a say over what we write. But I think in the film, I think you see the Westmoreland coming back addressing the joint session of Congress, and before Tet 68, Johnson is on a PR binge to sell the war. In 1967, before Tet comes, and he brings Westmoreland. They have a joint session of Congress. They have this thing, and they set themselves up. They set themselves up for Tet. After Tet, they fall into this trap, and they don't really know how to get out of it. And then I think the press gets more freedom. Then the press gets more freedom to be more critical. I think the press is, I think when Morley Safer is reporting on how the Marines land in 1965, at that time, the American press is not against the Vietnam War. The American press at that time is against Ngo Dinh Diem. They're against Diem, but they're not against the war. And they still want to be for the war. I think the American journalists for a long time want to support the American effort. It gets to a point where they don't support the American effort. It gets to the point where we live in a democracy, and America doesn't support the American effort. But I think they do a good job, but I don't think they lead. That's where I would be.
This is sort of shifting the topic a little bit, but I was wondering if it would be appropriate if I talked a little bit about the South Vietnamese press. Oh, please. So I think the South Vietnamese press actually plays a very interesting role. Not necessarily in changing the, not necessarily in changing the course of the war, but I think it tells us a lot about South Vietnam as a political space. So for the first 9 years, under Ngo Dinh Diem, the South Vietnamese press plays a pretty important role in spreading anti-communism. It's because it's under the thumb or under a considerable pressure from the Ministry of Information. There are also a number of anti-communist nationalists, especially in about 54, 55, who get really excited and they decide, well, we're going to publish our own newspaper and we're going to talk about all the horrible things the communists did. So it comes both from government pressure and of a sincere conviction. However, one of the problems is that Ngo Dinh Diem was probably more repressive of the press, the local press, than any other of his successors. And so that meant that the Ministry of Information also pressured the press to cover certain events, to publish certain articles. So sometimes you will see the same article appearing in 4 newspapers. You can imagine that if you live under the society, it makes you question the press because you don't know which article came from where. And I think that really affects how people view the press. So after Ngo Dinh Diem falls, I think the press really tries to play a role in pushing for change. And I think that the press is actually one of the places that we see the most differences between Hanoi and Saigon, in the sense that even though there was censorship, it was a boundary that people knew, like vaguely knew where it was, and they pushed against it so they could critique the government up to a certain point. Whereas in North Vietnam, the press was largely controlled directly by the party or the government. So that means that in South Vietnam, there's this narrow space for political action. It's not completely free, we don't have total freedom of press, but there's this relative freedom of press. And what the press is trying to do in the years after Ngo Dinh Diem falls is continually try to push that and enlarge that space, and they're very much hemmed in by the government.
I don't know where I came in. I heard something about the distinguished role of the press in the war in Vietnam,
That was me.
which just astonishes me. The people who were the most prominent reporters probably did a pretty good job of reporting the kinds of things that most laymen think wars are all about. You know, battles and bombing and artillery and logistics and those kinds of things. Which meant to me that as we moved into the latter part of the war, as I've tried to describe briefly, those things became less important, and what became more important was the things that were happening in the pacification program and the economic development of South Vietnam and the introduction of miracle rice and other things like that, and there's virtually none of that reported in any serious way. And then my new friend, speaks of his admiration for Neil Sheehan and his book A Bright Shining Lie, which I consider to be an extraordinarily dishonest book. The nominal subject of that book is John Paul Vann, a very important person in our fighting of the war, particularly in the latter part of the war when he's deeply involved in the pacification program, as well as in the later fighting. Sheehan writes a book of, these are not the exact numbers, but let's say 675 pages. 600 pages go through TET 68, and he essentially dismisses the rest of the war in about 75 pages. Even though John Paul Vann, the nominal subject of his book, lives and works and has his most important responsibilities for 4 more years in this part that's dismissed. And Sheehan says, in effect, because early on, Vann was very critical of the way the war was being fought, and rightly so, in my opinion. And he and others shared those views with people like Sheehan and Malcolm Brown and Halberstam. And that was reported in the press, and you could say that that's good journalism. But now, John Paul Vann says, hey, things have really gone really well here now. He says at one point, you suffer more hazard from the hustling, bustling Lambrettas and whatever Hondas on the road than you do from the Viet Cong. So does Sheehan say, you can trust Vann if he says that, that's true, as he did in the early period? No. He said Vann sold out, can't trust him anymore. So I'm not sorry I can't join my friend Tom in his great admiration either for the press writ large or Neil Sheehan in the latter part of the war.
I'd like to comment. I think Neil Sheehan is a brilliant biographer, as well as a brilliant journalist. I think A Bright Shining Eye is a masterpiece. I think A Bright Shining Eye is the equivalent of American War and Peace. I think Bob Surley, describes John Vann correctly. And I think Neil Sheehan reports in the book about John Vann's, in his biography, that John Vann, in fact, does change the way that is described. And John Vann is not the person he was at Oppach when he gets to the Easter offensive. He's a completely different person. And I think what Sheehan does, Sheehan makes him a completely different person. The way that John Vann is in reality, he describes John Vann the way he described him. I think that's part of the genius of the Sheehan book, is that he's using Vann as a way to describe the war and the strategy of the war. And I think, we all know the other side of John Vann, but I think A Bright Shining Eye is a masterpiece, and I think this film benefited by that masterpiece. I read, after I had worked on this film for a bunch of years, I reread A Bright Shining Eye. I learned more after working on the film, reading Bright Shining Eye for a third time. It became even a bigger masterpiece for me, and I highly recommend the book.
If I can, I'd like to wrap this back to where I started about both certain approaches to history, if only approaches to history, and also gaining a sense of empathy by watching this documentary. First, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I think we need to be careful with this if only approach to history, because I think it can be dangerous. But so too can be looking at history as a search for blame. And we've heard Bob today say to bring out some of these folks that deserve blame: the media, Westmoreland, Congress. And we might ask ourselves to be careful with that approach to history. But I think we also should be reminded that empathy is an important part of this. So having watched the film, one of the most striking moments, I thought, was in the final episode when Bob is being asked to recall the fall of Saigon, and he says at the end of the film that he regrets to this day that he didn't lay waste to a number of students at Tufts University who were cheering the fall of Saigon. So we should ask ourselves not to judge that comment, because it's not our right to, I don't think, but to be empathetic with that comment, and then ask ourselves, how does that sense of anger over the results of the war color interpretations of the war and color the history of the war. Because I think it's important for us, again, speaking on from the American perspective, that there is a sense of disappointment and disillusionment, and yes, even anger over the outcome of the American endeavor in Vietnam. But that anger and disillusionment should not force us into a search for blame as we look backward, because I don't know if that's the most helpful way to use history in terms of gaining a sense of importance for that long endeavor in Vietnam, but also one that hopefully gets us to more of an appreciation for the differing voices that come out of that conflict.
All right, we are coming towards the end of our conference, but I want to end with one question that comes from the audience, and I think it might be a fitting one, something I've given a lot of thought to myself. This comes from Phil Jennings, who is a Marine captain and a helicopter pilot and flew into Laos and knows what he's talking about. The question is, on what date did we lose the war? So let me put that in another frame, particularly in context of the movie or the film. You recall from the opening segment, the voiceover, that said, the war began with good intentions and it ended in failure. And those of you who were on the advisory panel will know this. The debate that raged with Burns and Novick and all the other folks between the choice of the word defeat or failure was intense. I think it's a fascinating one. I have my views, but we're not here to hear my views. I'd like to throw that to the panel and again reinforce the question that Phil Jennings asked. At what point did we lose the war? Was it a defeat or was it something else?
If I may respectfully submit that might be a bit of a fallacious question. To me, and I think Nguyen brought this out quite perceptively, is that there were fundamental questions that were not for Americans to answer. Questions about independence, questions about sovereignty and who represents the people, questions about what it meant to be a Vietnamese in the modern era. And quite frankly, I don't think any of those questions could be answered by Americans or any foreigners, to be quite frank. And so I think it's important, and I think what this film hopefully will do for Americans in particular is to get us to move away from questions like that, did we lose or did we win, and start to think more about this American war in Vietnam, less as an American war and more about the war as a Vietnamese war.
I really don't care how many of you think that I'm crazy or fallacious or anything else. I read about the war the first time when I was 14 years old about Dien Bien Phu fell. 14 years later, shot down at Dien Bien Phu. All that time I studied the war. I was a pilot in Vietnam. I was a pilot for Air America. I then infiltrated into the Vietnam Veterans Against the War assholes, pardon me. I then went into Cubans and went to Mexico and went into Cuban groups that were against the war, a lot of them sending torturers to North Vietnam. I very, very strongly about the war, and here's the point. In 1972, late 72, most of our combat troops were out of Vietnam. It's just a fact. It's not something I'm making up. The Vietnamese, we all know, were very recalcitrant in peace, so Nixon ordered the Christmas bombing. It was called worse than the worst crime in the century. 1,500 people were killed. Half of the people were killed in the World Trade Center. And that was the worst crime of the century. But the Vietnamese came back and signed a peace treaty. And they said, we'll quit fighting. We'll give you your troops back. We'll give you your POWs back. And we came home from that war in 1973. And it was over for America, as you say. So what is it about us as a country that wants to ignore the fact then that we simply abandoned the people in South Vietnam to their fate.
Yeah.
Millions were killed after we left. Bob Sorley is exactly right in my opinion. I apologize for taking much time. I've spent a great deal of my life in this war in my head. I've written books about it. I've talked about it, lectured about it. I've never had anybody explain to me why we have to feel like in 1973 we lost that war in Vietnam. And the reason it's important is because it became a political war, and our politics then have never recovered from lying to ourselves about what was really at issue in the Vietnam War. Thank you very much.
Katie.
Yeah, so I'd like to comment. So I've written an entire book on the fall, so I know a little bit about it. But I think I agree with Professor Dattis in that it wasn't our war to lose. Ultimately, it was the South Vietnamese war to lose. Now, I agree with you 100% in the sense that we abandoned them. We certainly left them to the tender mercies of the communists. But ultimately, it was the South Vietnamese who were going to win or lose that war, and we can only do so much for them. I think in some ways we probably went overboard trying to help them. In other ways we didn't. But I have to agree with Professor Dattis. Ultimately, it was the South Vietnamese. We're the ones came home. They didn't. They were there for the duration. So.
Yeah, I want to just make a couple comments on that question. I think there were a couple key junctures. The coup of November 1st, 1963, I think was probably the single biggest event of the war. This actually also is relevant to Neil Sheehan because, in my view, Sheehan spent much of the ensuing period justifying why he and other journalists supported that coup, because at the time it was portrayed as this was going to be the coup that fixes the problems, these messy political problems. But by all accounts, the war goes dramatically worse. I mean, there's no U.S. combat troops in Vietnam in 1963, and the South Vietnamese are actually doing pretty well. That was a critical mistake, and we, the U.S. government, incited that with the journalists helping out, and I think that colors much of what Sheehan and Halberstam later write. There is the 73-74 period and a series of actions taken that preclude, reduce U.S. aid, preclude the use of air power. The series does mention this in the end of 74, there's a strategic reconnaissance by Hanoi. They attack in one province, in Phuoc Long, because they want to see if the Americans are coming back with their air power, because they know if the Americans are ready to bomb, that they're not going to be able to do what they want. And when we don't, then that's the signal to go ahead. The other comment I would make is, if you look at what our original objectives were in Vietnam, we accomplished those. Our broader objectives were to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. And for the most part, we did that for reasons that I alluded to earlier. Now, Vietnam and Indochina, Laos, Cambodia fall, and I think, in my view, that was disgraceful. We could have kept those going at a reasonable cost. But most of the rest of Southeast Asia did not go communist, and that is something that has ramifications for the United States today, where we are still competing with China.
So as usual, I'm going to try to turn that into a Vietnamese question. I think there are three moments that I would point to that was a loss, and not loss to a particular side, but loss of principles. So I would say 1945, 1954, and 1975. So as I've sort of alluded to, the Vietnamese nationalist movement is actually quite diverse. There are communists. There are also a variety of non-communists. There were actually multiple types of communists as well. And the question should have been, how do we create a state in which all of these groups can coexist and not kill each other? But in 1945, the communist-led Viet Minh seizes power. One of the first things they do, so about a couple days after the Declaration of Independence by Ho Chi Minh, one of the first things that happens is that they start purging, harassing, jailing, killing rival nationalists. In 1954, in South Vietnam, one of the first things Ngo Dinh Diem does is he also goes after not only communists, but anti-communist rivals. In 1975, after when the war ends, the post-war government, and there were promises of national reconciliation and harmony and not taking vengeance, one of the first things that happen is they go after people who are associated with the former regime. I think we can think all of those moments as moments where a government was faced with the problem of what do we do with people we disagree with? And the answer at all of those moments was we suppress them. And I think that loss of political diversity has a lot to do with the later conflict and the enduring divisions between Vietnamese people. And I think that is a loss for Vietnamese people as a whole, because for so much of the history of modern Vietnam, it's about people killing each other because they can't agree on what type of a government to have. And I think that is a true defeat for everyone.
You got 2 quick follow comments.
Very quickly, just to add one more point, historical juncture to what is really a question of how did the windows of opportunity continually narrow. And that would be November 15th, I think it is, 1961, when the Kennedy administration decides to militarize a conflict that it believes is largely political. And from that point forward, we go from under 700 U.S. military advisors to over 16,000 by the end of the Kennedy period. So it's a critical moment. There are obviously others, and we have all articulated them here. I very much agree that November 1st, 63 is a very critical moment. But I think when the Kennedy administration decides to change the nature of the American advisory commitment, that it crosses the river Styx.
With respect to the comment that you could only help the Vietnamese so much, we don't know what would have happened if the war had gone on. We can't say they would have prevailed or survived. We don't know that. But what we do know is when we stopped helping them, they went under. And the reason they did was because we no longer gave them the wherewithal. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese were getting from their communist sponsors greatly increased levels of support. As Tom Polgar cabled, and I told you, outcome no longer in doubt. Most Americans would not like it said that the communist governments of China and the Soviet Union proved to be better and more reliable allies to their patrons than the democratic Americans did to theirs. But, ladies and gentlemen, that is in fact the case.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for attending this fantastic discussion, our panelists especially. I'm also giving a shout out to all of you who are following us on Twitter and the live stream. It's been a fantastic experience, and thank you all for coming.